Well, in the early 21st century, there may be grounds to be concerned about the strength of the political order as based on the U.S. Constitution. We have to say that relative to the experience in much of the rest of the world, the U.S. Constitution has been a dramatic and stunning success. And it's worth asking why that's so. And I think one of the reasons, one of the things behind the success of the U.S. Constitution and the order that springs from it is the fact that those who wrote the Constitution asked themselves not only political questions, but they asked themselves psychological and moral questions. A basic question they asked is, what are people like? And given the realistic answer to that question about human nature, about human psychology, based on the answer to that question, then they said, given the facts of human nature, what's the best possible order we can create? Now, when we look at other constitutions around the world, we see a fairly widespread record of disaster. That is, constitutions that are basically meaningless in one way or another. This comes to us from the Constitution of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Most Americans refer to this country simply as North Korea. And the Constitution of North Korea calls for a socialist culture. It says that the socialist culture is flourishing, and it says that the state will contribute to the improvement of the creative ability of working people. It will meet their demands. It guarantees them freedom of speech and so on. And you can read the Constitution of North Korea, and there's language about freedom and prosperity and so on. But what we know about North Korea is that it is the most repressive regime on the face of the earth. We know that many, many people have starved to death in this country, where people's lives are micromanaged and controlled from birth to death. And so, regardless of what the Constitution of North Korea says about human flourishing, about freedom, about prosperity, it's irrelevant. The Constitution is an irrelevancy. The government does what it wants. This is not really a constitution, it's sort of a constitution of a political movement. But the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, it ends by saying that the proletarians, that is, the workers of the world, have nothing to lose but their chains if they will follow the communist program as outlined in this manifesto. They have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. But we know in reality that the communist systems that came into place in the world, beginning in the early 20th century, these regimes were marked by oppression, by political murder, and by the mass imprisonment of people deemed to be not in line with the order. And so the proletarians had a lot more to lose than their chains. They had to lose their freedoms, their rights, and in many cases, their lives. So this is an example, again, of political speech that sounds good, but in the end is really meaningless. This comes to us from the Constitution of a country in Latin America. And I won't translate the whole bit here, but it says that the state guarantees and protects human life from conception, and it provides security to the people of the country. And this phrase in the Constitution is meaningless because it is a country marked by an incredible degree of insecurity, of crime that's out of control, of criminals who rarely pay for their crimes, of politicians who are often collaborators with criminals. There's a police force in this country you can't trust, many judges that you can't trust. Corruption pervades the political and social order in this country. And so regardless of what the Constitution says, the reality is quite different. And so to the extent that that's true, then this statement in the Constitution of this country is meaningless. It means nothing at all. Let's look briefly at something from the Constitution of Afghanistan. The state in Afghanistan is obliged to create a prosperous and progressive society. It's supposed to promote social justice. It's supposed to protect human dignity. It says that any kind of privilege between citizens of Afghanistan is prohibited. But then we look at the graph here below, And we see that among Afghanis, more than 60% in a 12-month period paid a bribe to somebody. Corruption in Afghanistan is rampant. It's not the most corrupt country in the world, but it's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And so, regardless of what the Constitution says, the reality on the ground is something different. Social justice is not being pursued. Whatever social justice means, it means different things to different people. But in any sense, a sense that the state is working on behalf of the people, that the people who work in the state are not working to enrich themselves, but they're working for the good of the people, for the good of the country. I think we can say in a lot of cases in Afghanistan this simply is not true, and the fact that the Constitution says it is irrelevant. Now, one of the points that's made in this book, The Endurance of National Constitutions, is that only half of the constitutions in the countries of the world survive more than 9 years. And we often have news stories of new constitutions being written in different countries. This country's constitution, the Constitution of the United States, has been altered a number of times since it was originally written. Those alterations are called amendments, but not that much. And the Constitution that we have today is substantially what it was at the beginning. There have been some significant amendments since the beginning in the late 1700s, but the basic document put in place in the late 1700s is still with us. And one of the things we can point to that marks to the really remarkable success of the constitutional order is the election of 2000 here in the United States. And we won't go into any detail, but this was a very, very close election. The person who ended up winning the election, George W. Bush, actually won a smaller number of votes in the popular vote. That is, more individuals voted for his opponent, Al Gore, than voted for George Bush, but George Bush won in what's called the Electoral College. We can't stop and discuss what that means, but here's the point. The election was so close that it wasn't clear for a considerable length of time who won that election. For a considerable length of time, Americans did not know who won this election. And there was a lot of tension, and there was a lot of anger, and there was anxiety. And then, of course, when Al Gore, when he ended up losing that election, there were a lot of people who felt quite angry. And actually, a majority, as we said, of voters voted for him. But here's the remarkable point. Relative to what we experience in history, what we see in history, relative to what we experience in the world today, despite the tension, despite the anxiety, despite the anger of this, surrounding this very, very close election, there was never a fear of a military coup, never a fear of civil war, never a fear of a mass uprising. And I think what that points to is a system that has its challenges, but that at least to that point, the election of 2000, a system that worked pretty well. And that system is based on the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution was written in light of questions about human nature. And so the writers of the Constitution had a serious understanding of human nature. And one of the basic things they understood is that the facts about human nature apply not only to the people out there, but those facts also apply to us. So, for example, a very important person in the writing of the U.S. Constitution was James Madison. James Madison was brilliant. I think he understood that he was more brilliant than most of the people he came into contact with. But he understood that he wasn't infallible. He understood that the problems associated with human nature also applied to him. He, like the other writers of the Constitution, understood that every person is fallible, every person is corruptible, every person is liable to self-deception. As St. Paul says, everybody sins. And so what we need to do, given this fact of human nature, is put together a political system that will try to minimize the extent to which these negative destructive tendencies in human nature can pull the political system and thus the society apart. Let's just look at some of their observations. This comes to us from Alexander Hamilton, who is depicted on our $10 bill. And he asks why government has been instituted at all. Why do we need government? And he says, well, because the passions of men, people's passions, the desires and the ambitions that sometimes get in the way of reason, these passions will not conform sometimes to the dictates of reason. For that reason, we need a government that can provide some level of control to contain the passions of people. And we don't have to, read the newspaper very long or watch the news very long to see countries that are being ripped apart by the passions of people, tribal passions, ethnic passions, political passions that overcome people's reasons. Well, these countries are being ripped apart by passions, and Hamilton saw that people are passionate creatures, and we need to acknowledge that. It's not going to go away. What can we do to tame and to try to control that within a political system? James Madison said that he noticed that there is a degree of depravity in people, that people are capable of doing wicked things, of saying wicked things, of tearing other people down, and so on. But at the same time, they have other qualities which we esteem. The human ability to be helpful, the human ability to be hopeful, the human ability to sacrifice one's own interests for the good of another. So on the one hand, there is the side of human nature that makes us wince, but then we see these same tendencies in ourselves. There's the other side of human nature that we applaud. And so what we want to do is set up a system which will encourage the good and which will discourage the negative. Hamilton writes that he never expects to see a perfect work coming from imperfect people. So he doesn't anticipate that the U.S. Constitution will be a perfect document. And given the fact that we're all imperfect, what we want to do is bring people together in deliberation. And they will argue with one another, and they will debate, and they will have to compromise, and they'll bring their errors and their prejudices with them to the discussion, but they'll also bring their good sense and their wisdom together in the discussion. And in that cauldron, or in that that place of meeting where we're debating ideas and we're discussing things, maybe we can come to some kind of reasonable compromise that makes sense, that draws on the good ideas from different people. Now, Hamilton doesn't think we can arrive at perfection this way, but at least we can take the edge off the passions, and we can put together a system that will bring people together in the political system, and that will force them to compromise with one another in the political system, at least in the ideal situation. And so ambition must be made to counteract ambition, Madison says. So we have people who are quite politically liberal, people who are quite politically conservative. Let's pull them together in the constitutional system and see if we can arrange a system in which they will have to work together to get things done. And so Madison notes that it's a reflection on human nature, that we have to put together a system that will not allow one part of government to get too much power, because people are ambitious and they're passionate. So we need to check the ambition of groups. And so we want different groups in the political system to have different kinds of power. And so ambition counteracts power. If men were angels, Madison says, no government would be necessary. Well, of course, people are not angels, but neither are most of them devils. They're basically mixed. And so this is what Madison sees. And so one of the things that we want to do in this constitutional order, Madison says, is we want to enable the government to control the governed, that is, to provide a system in which people can pursue their interests in life. But we also want to set up a system in which the government is obliged to control itself, because the people in government are just as liable to the problems of the human condition as everyone else. Well, I think this reflection on human nature, on moral psychology, that underpins the U.S. Constitution helps to explain something of the success of the U.S. Constitution. Not only do the writers of the Constitution see that these problems apply to the people out there, but they also apply to us and they apply to people in power. And if we want a system that's going to work, then we have to put together a system in which the passions of the people can be counteracted with the passions of others. Put together a system where we're forced to compromise with one another, to work with one another. Well, given the tremendous success of the U.S. Constitution, historically speaking, and of course there are things to be concerned about in the early 21st century about the health of the constitutional order. But certainly coming into the early 21st century, we have to say that the U.S. Constitution has been a remarkable success. And therefore, I think we also have to say then that it is very unfortunate that so few Americans know anything about the U.S. Constitution. And so let me ask a few questions. What rights are guaranteed in the First Amendment? What specific rights are guaranteed in the First Amendment? Here's another question. Who has the constitutional power to declare war? And why hasn't a formal declaration of war been declared since December 1941? The U.S. has had a few wars since December 1941. So what's the story? What is the Due Process Clause, and how has it changed every American's life? There are many questions we could ask about the U.S. Constitution. If you don't have ready responses to these questions, I encourage you to look into them. And the reason I encourage you to do that is because more generally I encourage you to become familiar with the U.S. Constitution, with how the Constitution is set up, with who has what power in the constitutional system. If we want the Constitution to survive, if we want the constitutional system based on that piece of paper, the U.S. Constitution, to thrive, then it's in our interest to know what the Constitution says, so that if then we feel that the principles of the Constitution are being breached, we can say so, and we can say so from a position of knowledge. And so I think it's in our interest to become familiar with the basic elements of the U.S. Constitution. Okay, well, we'll say goodbye. Take care.